The plate of oxtails hit the 71-year-old dishwasher square in the chest, in front of 300 guests. Gravy down the front of her uniform, bone on the floor at her feet. And Corbin Walcott smiled, because he thought he had finally put the filthy old woman in her place. He had no idea he was standing in a building she owned, on land she owned, under a name that, by every right in this world, should have been hers. Her name was Willetta Tolliver, though nobody in that kitchen had ever heard it spoken. To them she was Miss Etta, the gray-headed woman at the dish pit, the one who brought a beat-up cast-iron pan to work in a grocery bag like it was made of gold. Corbin had mocked her for that pan her first week, told her to throw the garbage out before it stunk up his kitchen. That same pan cooked the first meal ever served in that building. 40 years back, when the place had a different name. When the place was hers. So let me tell you how a woman ends up on her knees scrubbing pots in an empire she built with her own hands, and what she did the night they finally pushed her too far. The restaurant sat on Lark Street in Albany, 3 stories of brick and gold light, and people flew in from 3 states to eat there. The Walcott House. There was a bronze statue of Emmett Walcott in the lobby, one hand on his heart, the plaque calling him the visionary founder who brought fine dining to upstate New York. Cooks rubbed its shoe for luck before a big service. Willetta walked past that statue 6 nights a week on her way to the sink, and never once broke her step. She had known Emmett Walcott when he was a hungry young money man with cheap shoes and a good handshake. He had never cooked a meal in his life, not one. But you cannot understand what she took back until you understand what they stole. Willetta grew up in a 2-room house outside Waycross, Georgia, raised by her grandmother Dosha. Dosha had hands like tree roots, and she could cook oxtails until grown men wept at the table and forgot their own names. She smothered them low and long in a black iron pan until the meat fell off the bone into gravy the color of dark honey. On Sundays, folks lined up in her yard with empty bowls. When Dosha died, she left Willetta 2 things. The recipe, which lived only in Willetta's hands and nowhere on paper, and the pan. Willetta carried that pan north to Albany in 1979 with $11 and a husband named Wardell, who believed in her more than she believed in herself. Wardell drove a delivery truck all day and washed dishes all night, so she could open a little 6-table room on Lark Street. She named it Dosha's, after the woman who taught her everything, and she cooked her grandmother's oxtails for anybody who walked in. 6 tables became 12. 12 became a line out the door in the rain. Critics who came to laugh at the neighborhood soul food spot stayed to weep into their napkins. Within 10 years, Dosha's was the hardest reservation in the state. A black woman from a 2-room house in Georgia had built something the men with business degrees could not build. She fed the mayor and the men who paved the streets at the same tables, treated exactly alike, and that was the whole point of her. She had a saying, and she gave it to every new hire on their first morning, standing at the range with her grandmother's pan on the flame. You want the truth about a house, she would tell them, then don't ask the man in the nice suit at the front. Ask the person washing the pots in the back. However that person gets treated when nobody important is watching, that is what your house really is. Everything else is a costume. Remember that. It matters later. Emmett Walcott came into her life in 1994, and he came in smiling. He had money and a plan to take Dosha's national. Restaurants in Boston, in Manhattan, in Washington. He talked fast and he talked pretty, and Wardell warned her the very first night. That man watches your hands when you sign things, Wardell muttered over the sink. He don't watch your face. He watches the pen. A man like that is counting something. But the dream was big, and Willetta was tired of being told a woman like her could only get so far. So she signed. Papers she never fully understood. Papers Emmett swore were only about growth. Every year there were more of them, and every year her name got a little smaller in them and his got a little bigger. So she told herself Wardell had been wrong about the man. Then Wardell got sick. It was his pancreas, and it was fast, and it was cruel. Willetta stepped back from the business to nurse him. She spent her nights spooning broth between his cracked lips and her days holding his hand through the pain, and she trusted Emmett Walcott to mind the house while she minded her husband. That was the window, the exact window Emmett had been counting toward the whole time. While Willetta sat at a dying man's bedside, Emmett called a meeting she was never told about. He used one of those papers she had signed years before, a paper about voting shares she never truly grasped, and in a single afternoon, he voted her out of her own creation. He declared her no longer fit to lead a growing business. He offered her a settlement, called it generous, and called it final. Wardell died on a Tuesday in the spring. Willetta buried him on a Friday. And the following Monday, before the flowers on the grave had wilted, Emmett changed the name over the door from Dosh's to the Walcott House. He took her grandmother's name off the building. He took Dosh's oxtails, the recipe that lived only in Willetta's hands, and had his chef's guess added from memory, and put it on the menu as the founder's oxtail, credited to his own genius. He wrote a company history that did not contain her name at all. Not a footnote. Not a line. In the official story of that famous restaurant, Willetta Tolliver had simply never existed. You would think a story like that ends with a broken old woman. It does not, because there was one thing Emmett Walcott, for all his fast talk and clever papers, did not think to want. The young lawyer sitting beside Willetta the day they carved up her life was a sharp woman named Marceline Prentice, fresh out of school and furious at what she was watching. And Marceline noticed something every expensive man in that room had overlooked. They all wanted the brand. The name, the reputation, the shine. Not one of them cared about the dirty, old brick buildings the restaurants actually stood inside. Real estate was boring, slow money. The men wanted the crown, and they left the ground it sat on for the widow. Take the buildings, Marceline whispered, gripping her arm in the hallway. Let them have the flashy part. You take the dirt under their feet, and your grandmother's name goes in the papers with it. They want to be called Walcott anyway. Let them. Dosha stays yours. Trust me. So the settlement Emmett called generous handed Willetta the one thing nobody else valued that day. She walked away owning the actual buildings, the bricks, the land, including the 3-story building on Lark Street where it all began. And then Willetta Tolliver disappeared. For 22 years, the whole world believed she had gone home to Georgia to die broke. Nobody looked for her. But Willetta was not in Georgia dying. She was working, out of sight, patient as her grandmother stirring a pan. She and Marceline built something in the dark. Every dollar of that settlement and every rent check the Walcotts mailed her without knowing it was her went into one thing. Buying. The land under Boston. The land under Manhattan. The garage in Washington. One brick building at a time. Over 2 decades. All held inside a trust with a name so plain nobody ever bothered to ask who was behind it. The Walcott empire grew fat and famous and proud. And with every passing year, more of the ground it stood on belonged to a woman it had erased. Emmett Walcott died in 2015, celebrated as a legend. His son Weldon took the chairman's seat. And Weldon's boy Corbin, raised his whole life on the fairy tale of his brilliant grandfather, was handed the crown jewel to run when he was barely 30. The original building on Lark Street. Corbin Walcott had never washed a dish in his life either. It ran in the family. Which brings us to this past winter and the morning an old woman in a threadbare coat walked into the Walcott house kitchen with a cast iron pan and a grocery bag and asked for the dishwashing job on the night shift. Marceline had arranged it. A word here, a staffing agency there, a plain application under a plain name. Nobody in that building had ever seen a photograph of the woman they had scrubbed out of the history books. To Corbin, she was cheap hands for the sink. Here is where you might stop me and ask the question everyone asks. Why? Why would a woman who owned the ground under the whole empire, one signature from taking it all back, get on her knees and scrub pots in her own house while a spoiled boy treated her like dirt? She had told Marceline the same thing the week before, when Marceline tried to talk her out of it. I built that house on one idea. How it treats the person at the sink. Before I decide whether it deserves to live or burn, I am going to be the person at the sink, and I am going to learn what my house became. Marceline did not let it go easy. She leaned across the desk and held her old friend's eyes. And how many people are you willing to watch him hurt while you make up your mind? Willetta did not have a clean answer for that. She looked at the pan in her lap a long moment, and the truth was she never found one. She went anyway, and the question went with her. The first weeks nearly broke her body. She was 71. And the dish pit at a place like that is a war. Scalding water, endless racks, the sprayer kicking back at her wrists until her knuckles cracked and bled. She taped her hands and worked through it. Up before the sun and home long after midnight, and never once complained, because she had promised herself she would see all of it. And she saw plenty. She watched Corbin scream a 19-year-old prep girl into tears over a tray of parsley, then dock her pay for crying. She watched him fire a dishwasher on Christmas Eve for asking to go home to his kids and laugh about it after. Ask the person at the sink, her grandmother's voice said in her head. And the answer her house kept giving her, night after night, was an ugly one. But she saw something else too. She saw the boy on the line named Booker. Booker Greer was 24 and he had hands. Real hands, the kind nobody can teach. Willetta had cooked for 40 years and she knew talent the second it moved, and this boy had it burning in him with nowhere to go. Corbin kept him chained to the lowest station, plating other men's food, because Booker had no culinary school on his resume and no family name and no way to fight back. He never argued. He came in early, stayed late, did every ugly job Corbin threw at him, because he was raising his little sister Zora alone since their mother passed, and this job was the roof over that 11-year-old's head. And from the very first week, Booker was kind to the old woman at the sink. He did not have to be. Nobody else was. But he noticed Miss Etta worked the whole night without a break, and one evening he slid a warm plate across to her while Corbin was out front. "Eat, Miss Etta," he pressed, bumping the plate closer with his elbow. "Can't scrub on an empty stomach. My grandmother would come back and haunt me." Willetta took one bite of the food that boy had cooked, and she had to turn to the wall so he would not see the water stand up in her eyes. The child had seasoned it right. He had the instinct, the thing she had. And nobody in that gleaming, famous, lying building had ever bothered to find out. She watched Booker after that, and he saved her a plate every night. There was one more who mattered. Burley Dunmore, 61, a server who had worked that floor for 30 years, back to when the place was still Dosh's. She was the only soul left in the building old enough to remember when the food had a soul in it. And she kept looking at Miss Etta. Something about the old woman's hands on that black pan tugged at a thread 30 years buried in her memory. One night she leaned in the doorframe and studied her a long time. "Have we met before, honey?" Burley tilted her head, searching the old face. "A long time ago? I feel like I have stood in a kitchen with you." Willetta wrung out her rag and kept her back half turned. "A lot of kitchens. A lot of years. We all start to look alike after a while." Burley let it go. But she kept looking, and a warm suspicion started growing in her chest that she could not name. Every night before shift, Willetta took her grandmother's cast iron out of the grocery bag, oiled it with her bare fingers, and set it on the corner of the range where nobody cooked. It was the one thing in that whole building that was truly hers. Corbin hated it. Twice he ordered her to throw it in the dumpster, and twice she came in the next morning and set it right back. And he could never quite bring himself to force it with a harmless old woman, because a small ugly part of him enjoyed the game. Then came the invitation, and everything sped up. The Walcott house was turning 40, and Corbin, hungry to make his own mark and finally impress his father, planned a night the city had never seen. A founder's anniversary gala. 300 guests, every food writer in the Northeast, the deputy mayor, and the crown jewel of the evening. Isadora Beaumont was coming. You have to understand what that name meant. Isadora Beaumont was the most feared restaurant critic in the country. One review from her could crown a place or bury it in a night. Corbin had chased her with letters for a year, and she had finally agreed to sit in his dining room on the very night they celebrated the great Emmett Walcott and taste the famous founder's oxtail for herself. The kitchen ran on fear for 2 weeks. Corbin screamed. He threw pans. He fired 2 people just to make the rest afraid. And the night of the gala, the building glowed like a jewel box, and the bronze statue of the man who had stolen everything wore a fresh garland of white roses. Willetta stood at her sink in her gray uniform and watched the lie put on its finest clothes. The trouble started at 9 o'clock, and it was not her doing. Isadora Beaumont's oxtail went out to table 1, the most important plate in the building's history, and Corbin himself had plated it, shaking with nerves. And it came back. A runner carried it in with the critic's note, and Corbin read it, and the blood drained from his face. The note said the dish was cold in the center, and the sauce had broken. It said, in Isadora Beaumont's own famous hand, that she had eaten better oxtails in a church basement. Corbin had a decision to make, and it showed everyone exactly what he was. He had rushed the dish. He had plated it himself, too proud to let anyone check it and send it out broken. His failure, no one else's. And with the most powerful critic in America sitting 40 feet away, he decided he needed someone to blame. His eyes swept the kitchen and landed on the old woman at the sink. You. He was already crossing toward her, the broken plate in his fist. You washed the pan this went in. You left soap in it. You ruined it. Willetta had not touched that pan. Everyone in the kitchen knew it. Booker knew. Verley, coming through the door with a tray, knew. I never touched your pan. Willetta held his stare instead of dropping it. Corbin could not stand to be looked at like that. Not by her. So he did the thing he would spend the rest of his life wishing he could take back. He grabbed the old dishwasher by her thin arm and dragged her through the swinging doors into the packed dining room, out into the gold light in front of all 300 guests, the deputy mayor, and Isadora Beaumont herself. He wanted an audience. He got one that would ruin him. This. He shoved Willetta forward so hard she stumbled and he flung the plate. It struck her in the chest, and gravy and bone slid down the front of her uniform and dropped to the floor at her feet. This is what ruined your dinner, Miss Beaumont. This is what I have to work with. A filthy, careless, useless old woman who cannot even wash a pan without destroying a masterpiece. The whole room went silent. 300 forks stopped in the air. And Willetta Tolliver stood in the center of the dining room she had built 40 years before, her grandmother's gravy dripping down her chest, a whole city staring at her like garbage a boy had dragged out to show off. That is the bottom of the well. Get out. Corbin hissed at her. You are done. You are fired. Get out before I have you thrown out. And that was the inch too far. It came from the back of the room first, a young voice, cracking with rage, cutting through the silence. She never touched that pan. It was Booker. He had come out of the kitchen still in his apron, and every person in that room turned to watch a line cook throw away the only paycheck standing between his little sister and the street. He knew exactly what it would cost. He spoke anyway. You plated that dish yourself, chef. Booker's voice broke, but he pushed on. You rushed it, you sent it out cold, and everybody in that kitchen saw you do it. She never touched it. You are blaming an old woman because you are too much of a coward to say you failed. Corbin's face went purple. You are fired. Both of you. Get out. Get. Let the boy finish. It was not loud, but it stopped the room dead because it came from the old woman covered in gravy, and there was something under it that made every hair on Corbin's neck stand up. Willetta reached down, lifted one of the fallen oxtails off the floor, held it to her nose, and breathed it in like a woman greeting an old friend. And when she spoke to the whole room. This is not my grandmother's recipe. This is a photograph of it. Somebody described her cooking to a stranger, and the stranger guessed. There is no clove in this gravy. She always finished it with a whisper of clove. Corbin, honey, you have been selling a copy of a copy of a copy for 40 years, calling it a founder's masterpiece. And tonight the best palate in America tasted the difference and sent it back. Isadora Beaumont set down her glass. She was watching now. Every eye was. Corbin forced out a laugh. And who exactly would you be? To lecture me about my own grandfather's recipe? That is the question. Willetta held his eyes. Isn't it? The front doors opened. Marceline Prentice had come to serve the notice tonight of all nights. The first night the Walcotts stood on ground that was no longer theirs, and she walked in out of the winter night with a leather folder under her arm and crossed the room to Willetta's side, like a soldier reporting for the last day of a 22-year war. Willetta rested her cracked hand on the folder. Corbin, my name is Willetta Tolliver. I opened this restaurant in 1979, and I named it Dosh's after my grandmother, whose oxtails you have been butchering on that menu for 4 decades. Your grandfather took the name off my door the same week I buried my husband. He wrote me out of the history you have recited your whole life. That statue you rubbed for luck? I knew that man when he could not boil water. The dining room had stopped breathing. But here is the part your family never told you. She opened the folder on the table in front of Isadora Beaumont, so the most powerful witness in the country could read every word. They wanted the name. They never wanted the buildings. So I took the buildings. This one, Boston, Manhattan, Washington. Every rent check your company mailed for 22 years came to me. Marceline laid one sheet on top of the rest and spoke to the whole silent room. The lease on this building and the land beneath it expired at midnight last night. It was not renewed. Every hour this gala has run tonight. Every one of you has been standing on her land. As of this morning, the Walcott house has no ground beneath it, and the name Doshas belongs, and always belonged, to the woman your chef just threw a plate at. Somewhere in the crowd a phone was already up, recording. Then another. Then a dozen. The video of Corbin dragging an old woman into a dining room and flinging food at her chest was already leaving that building, flying out into the world faster than anyone could stop it. Corbin's mouth opened and nothing came out. His father Weldon rose from the head table, gray and shaking. Weldon had been in the room the day they voted her out. He knew that face, 22 years older, and he understood, watching his son frozen in a puddle of stolen gravy, that the family fairy tale had just died in front of every camera in the Northeast. But Willetta did not scream at Corbin, and she did not have him thrown out. She turned around, walked back through the swinging doors into her kitchen, and lifted her grandmother's cast iron off the corner of the range where it had waited all those weeks. She set it on the flame. Booker, she called over her shoulder to the boy who had risked everything for her. The critic's oxtails, the ones that came back, and the batch you finished braising for tomorrow. Bring me both, and bring me the clove. Because here's the truth about what was wrong with that dish. The meat was not the problem. Corbin's cooks had braised it low and long, hours of it, exactly as the menu demanded, and the oxtails themselves were tender enough. What they had was a broken sauce and a hollow center, a recipe copied by strangers who never knew the last secret. Willetta did not need to cook a new pot from scratch. She needed to finish theirs, as it should have been finished all along. So for the next half hour, an erased old woman and a chained young cook rebuilt that broken gravy in a black iron pan. Isadora Beaumont watching from her table, guests pressed toward the open kitchen doors, the rest of the room turned in their seats to see. She pulled the tender meat from Corbin's failed batch. She mounted the sauce back together with a patience his cooks were never taught. She corrected the seasoning by taste, not by any written line, and at the very end she finished it with a whisper of clove, the one thing 40 Years of Thieves had never known to add. When Willetta set the finished plate down in front of Isadora Beaumont, the whole room leaned in. The critic took one bite. She set her fork down, and Isadora Beaumont, who had buried 100 restaurants and never once been known to weep, sat in that dining room with tears standing in her eyes. There it is. She pressed her napkin to her mouth. That is the thing everyone has been chasing and nobody could find. I have eaten the copy at 4 of your locations and wondered what was missing. It was her. It was always her. The review Isadora Beaumont wrote 3 days later did not bury a restaurant. It resurrected a woman, under a headline the whole country read. The ghost who owned the house. It told the true story of Doshas and Willetta Tolliver and a recipe from a 2-room house in Waycross, Georgia, and it named Emmett Walcott exactly what he was. The Walcott group did not survive it. You cannot survive owning nothing and being exposed as a thief in the same week. Weldon resigned. The statue came down. And Corbin was destroyed by one thing alone, his own cruelty on a stage he built himself. He had thrown food at an old woman in front of 300 people to protect a lie, and the whole world watched him do it, and no restaurant in America would let that man near a dining room again. She never pressed a single charge. She never had to. He had done it to himself. But this story does not end with the man who lost. It ends with the people who deserve to win. Willetta took her building back, and she put the old name over the door. Doshas, in warm gold letters, 40 years late. The morning they hung the sign, she stood on the sidewalk in the cold and looked up at her grandmother's name shining over Lark Street again. And she reached up and laid her hand flat against the bottom letter, the same cracked, taped, ruined hand Corbin had called useless in front of a whole city. She stood there a long while with her palm on that gold. Then she spoke, so soft only the sign could hear it. "We made it back, Grandma. 40 years late. But we made it back." And Willetta Tolliver let herself cry for the first time in 22 years. She did not run the kitchen herself. She was 71, her war was won, and her hands had earned their rest. So she gave the kitchen to the one who had earned it beside her. She placed the keys in Booker Greer's palm the day she made him partner, then pressed one more thing into his hands. Her grandmother's cast iron pan, black and worn and holy. This cooked the first meal we ever served. She closed his fingers around the handle. It should cook the next 40 years too. You feed people right. And when some young fool wanders in here one day looking like they got no place in the world, you make sure the person at your sink gets treated like family. That is the whole business. Everything else is a costume. Booker could not speak. He held the pan against his chest like the child it was, and he wept. Little Zora got a place in a good school and a college fund with her name on it. So her whole future would never again hang on whether her brother could survive one more cruel man's kitchen. Burley Dunmore, who had felt the truth in her chest for months before her mind could catch it, was made head of the dining room. And on opening night she stood at the door in a fine dress and welcomed people home to a place she thought she had lost forever. And Marceline Prentice, the young lawyer who once gripped a grieving widow's arm and said take the dirt under their feet, trust me, stood beside her oldest friend as the room filled with light and the smell of dark honey and clove. Neither of them said a word. They had waited 22 years to smell that kitchen again. So here's what I keep turning over, and I need to know where you land because I go back and forth myself. Willetta could have walked into that building on her very first morning and taken back everything that was hers. One signature. She held the papers the whole time. Instead, she got down on her knees at that sink for weeks, and she let Corbin humiliate that prep girl and dock her pay for crying, fire that man on Christmas Eve, and hurl food at her own chest in front of a whole city. Also, she could be sure of what her house had become before she moved. Marceline asked her the right question before she ever put on that uniform. How many people are you willing to watch him hurt while you make up your mind? Willetta never answered it. Maybe she couldn't. So was she patient? Or did her patience become permission? If you held every card from the first morning, would you have knelt at that sink and waited for proof? Or would you have walked in on day one and stopped him before one more person got hurt? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this one moves something in you, stay a while because I have more of them and every one of them comes back to the same truth. A house is not what the sign over the door says it is. A house is how it treats the person standing at the sink.